So hey folks, Zito here, finally back with another episode of the Canoe build. Sorry it's taken so long. Just kind of really wanted to go through the process and get a couple steps done before started making more of these. So today I'm going to talk about the making of the molds. It took about 2 days or so to kind of get them all done, and I made the molds out of particle board, which I really liked over the MDF that I used for the strong back. And so here's the particular process. Hope you guys enjoy. Take care. So while Canoecraft recommends using things like a batten and pins to kind of trace out the molds over the pieces of particle board, I actually decided to print off 7 copies of the plans themselves. I went to Staples. Each set of plans printed out for approximately $3 a copy. So, you know, ended up costing about 30 bucks for copies of these the molds themselves. And then I also ended up getting the stem molds done, 2 copies of that done as well. So with 2 49-inch by 97-inch sheets of particle board, I calculated the approximate sizes of the molds themselves, and that basically created a cut list that I would then use to cut out the approximate sizes of said molds. I know in Canoecraft they say to cut them to about 22 inches or so tall, but in our instance, most of the molds were actually closer to 24.5 inches. In Nick Offerman's DVD, he was speculating some of his molds were actually about 26 inches tall. In this case, I ended up cutting to about 24.5 inches or so, and was still a bit short with some of them. So I ended up using a cleat to raise the height of them. So that was my experience with this part. So cutting out each of the molds, cutting out the rough approximate sizes, I would then take the traces of the molds, that were half the mold essentially, and write that onto the particle board itself, or just essentially trace along the edges. And I found that it actually was pretty accurate, or as accurate as I wanted to be anyhow. And then of course you would flip it and then kind of do it at the same time. Now with the particle board itself, because most of the molds for this particular canoe, the Ranger, were mirrored except for station mold 0, I ended up drilling and screwing 2 pieces of particle board together before I would actually jigsaw out the piece. So as stipulated, once the 2 pieces were together and also traced out, I would then actually use a jigsaw and kind of jigsaw the rough shape around. Once that particular shape was cut out, I would then go and refine it with a Szeto rasp that we had in the shop. This was great for particle board. Generally, if you're using things like plywood, you might want to consider using spoke shave, but it was kind of catching on a bunch of things, so this particular rasp was excellent for this particular process. And then once rasped down, I would then refine it with some 60 grit sandpaper and a random orbital sander that would just essentially knock off anything else on there. So with the molds and the cleats in place, I would then clamp the molds to approximate center points based on the center line of the strong back. I would basically place them with clamps, and then I'd drill into them. Drill them to kind of give them a rough spot, and then, you know, drill them into the cleat, knowing that they'd have to move a little later on. But I'd put them all out just to take a look at, you know, what the overarching shape of the canoe would then look like. With all my molds in place, I would actually then take the stem mold, and with the stem mold I actually drilled a screw into the top of it, but giving enough clearance so that the piece of string would actually never touch any of the station molds. Once I did that on both stem molds, I would then put a piece of string across the entire strong back, and as you can see, you can then line things up, and I would essentially line things over and make sure that they were centered according to that piece of string there. And that essentially ensured that I had a straight set of station molds ready to plank, essentially. So from there, the one other thing was to ensure that my station molds would essentially be square and straight, but also keep them in place in that position. And so what I ended up having to do was put a batten down over top. And I ended up squaring up each of the molds and then drilling with the batten, a screw on top to just hold everything down in that particular shape. And then with every station mold straight, in spot and everything and in line, we're pretty much ready for our planking, which is a beautiful thing. So thanks a ton for checking out the station molds process and just how I kind of went about this. I know I didn't go into a ton of details, but if you have any questions, feel free to comment below. I'll try and help out. There's also a ton of great resources between, you know, videos from a guy doing stuff and also Nick Offerman's DVDs, which I watched over and over and over again. Yeah, there's a ton of great resources out there. So yeah, keep an eye up on those. Coming up next will be the actual stems themselves and how I laminated those together. and planking hopefully sooner than later. So thanks a lot and stay tuned. More to come on this build. Thanks. Take care.